putting more money into programs, into officers, into security cameras, into disciplinary practices that are pushing them out instead of the supports necessary to keep them in schools. So really quickly, so in New York City we have Mayor Bloomberg, and yeah, that is the same response that we have in New York City. So for 3 terms, he's going to be our mayor. So we are fortunate that this is his last year in office. Yep. So before that, we had a Board of Education, and the Board of Education handed over the School Safety Division to the New York Police Department. This means that the New York Police Department is now in charge of handling safety in our schools, in all the public schools in New York City. And what we saw was that in the 10 years that Bloomberg has been in mayor, we have seen an increase of money and resources being funneled into this school safety division, and we're seeing drastic cuts to guidance counselors, after-school programs, teachers, staff, books and resources, and we've seen an increase in metal detectors in schools that have metal detectors, and we've seen also an increase in security cameras and what they call as roving metal detectors. So a school that once didn't have metal detectors, one day they show up and the whole day, the whole week is disrupted. And in the 10 years that this has happened, we saw a decrease in the number of students. So for years, youth organizations and advocacy groups in New York City were fighting to figure out why is this happening? What's actually going on in our schools? And what is the data that proves the stories that we already know, right? That 14-year-olds, that 7-year-olds just recently, right, in the Bronx, are being handcuffed and arrested for minor infractions such as talking back, being in the hallway, even for fighting, and are now having criminal records. So in 2009, we formed a coalition that passed the Student Safety Act, which is the first legislation of its kind. And we had that mandated the New York Police Department and the NYPD, the New York Police Department and the Department of Education to report the data, to make public the data that we already know, right? How many suspensions are happening in our schools? How many arrests are happening in our schools? How many young people are served tickets in our schools? And breaking that information by gender, by age, and by race. And the results that we got for our first year were very shocking, but we knew that this was going on, right? So from the 2010 to 2011 school year, we had over 74,000 suspensions in New York City public schools. An overwhelming 53% of those suspensions were African American students, who only make up 33% of the student population, right? So that's 53% of suspensions, and only make up 33% of the student population. And we saw last year that there were 881 arrests in schools.
That ain't right.
Arrests, right? So this is what's actually going on. And New York City, in school safety division, has over 5,200 NYPD staff, right? So that's 5,000 school safety officers and 200 armed NYPD cops in our schools, right? That is more than the Washington, D.C. and Detroit have in the entire police department.
That ain't right.
I'm sure it's not right. Right, so what we're seeing is that when we're criminalizing young people, right, when they're engaging in confrontations with police, which historically has had troubled, there's a troubled relationship between police in low-income communities of color across the country, right? So now you're exposing students to that in their communities and in their schools. And we're seeing that they're cutting all these resources, and they're spending a lot more time thinking about how to suspend a student for writing on a desk for 5 days, how to suspend a student for talking back to a teacher and remove them from the class for 10 days, how to suspend students for 30, 60, even 90 days, and not provide them with an opportunity to stay in the classroom and really figure out what are the issues that are happening. Young people come to school with a lot of baggage, right? Coming from troubled homes, from communities that are suffering, and that all resonates with our young people. And we're seeing that instead of going to the core of what's going on, instead of investing in keeping our students in the classroom, what the Department of Education in New York City is doing is that they're actually just pushing them away. And even though there are alternative learning centers, which is the place that students are supposed to go when they get suspended for a long-term suspension, those have a retention rate of 50% of the students that get suspended. So you have young people that are suspended for 30, 60, 90 days and are at home, or in the street, or trying to find a job, or they don't come back to school when the suspension is over. And this is a crisis that's happening across the country. And what we've learned over the past few years about doing this work, right, is that this crisis is targeting a particular population of young people. Like I said, black and brown boys, and low-income students and students with special needs. And this isn't happening in Stuyvesant or in Brooklyn Tech or in Bronx Science, which are the specialized high schools. These are happening in schools that are in my communities. So for the past few years, it's been really difficult to engage because the Department of Education refuses to admit that there's a problem. They refuse to admit that they are the reason why this is happening, that if you cut guidance counselors, if you cut supports for teachers, if you cut after-school programming, if you cut social workers, right, there's not even a line for college advisors in the Department of Education, right? If you cut all these services, then what do you expect? What do you expect for our young people? So we've been working for the past few years, and we passed the Student Safety Act, which is the first legislation of its kind in the country. And right now we've been engaging, like I said before, we're going to have a new mayor. So we've been really thinking about how to engage with a strategy that's going to get us positive solutions, right? So instead of just calling out the issue, the young people, the parents, the educators have to be yelling out a solution, right? So we've been talking about implementing restorative justice approaches, right? So really figuring out what are the supports that young people need, what are the supports that teachers need to be able to handle students in the classroom, and really wrestle with how do we talk about a fight? How do we engage parents in this? How do we engage students, the rest of the student population, into ensuring that our schools are safe, right? I think we need to define what school safety is, what school climate looks like, and really ensure that all schools, not just the special ed high schools, are has a college-going culture, that are very supportive. And so we've been working for the past few years, and this 2012 actually managed to get really progressive changes in the New York City Discipline Code. So we eliminated suspensions for level 1 and 2 infractions, which are anything from wearing a hat to talking back to a teacher to being late for class. And right now we're working to eliminate suspensions for level 3, which is non-violent contact. So if students are yelling at each other, or even if they're shoving each other, to ensure that they're in the classroom. And I think some of the hardest things that we've encountered is that, the Department of Education is saying that there's no resources, that they have no money to be able to implement these positive approaches to discipline, and that they refuse to even engage parents in letting them know of the changes in the discipline code. But that's not true. We know that there's money in the budget. They're just not allocating it correctly to the support services that we need for our young people. So we're really excited this year to think about a new mayor, new possibilities, building relationships with the United Federation of Teachers, building relationships with our city council representatives, our speaker of the city council, who is also running for mayor, and really ensuring that the young people's stories are being told and that they're the ones telling it. And that they're the ones, the young people and the parents are the ones that are asking for these changes, demanding these changes to ensure that we are increasing the graduation rate. That's what we always talk about, right? Increasing the graduation rate. So this is an opportunity for us to really engage, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions towards the end.
And we will have opportunity for questions. Thank you, Maria. Okay, and next speaker is Keith Jones, who's a parent from Buffalo Schools and has been very active as a leader in fighting for around the same issues. So we go from one end of the state to the other, we see the same problems existing.
Yeah, it was very interesting to find out that we're not the only district. Before I start, I just want everybody to know that somebody might know or say something. I've been incarcerated. So that's why I feel so passionate about this education. It's with education now dealing with suspensions because things are not right. I do stuff now. I'm involved in schools. I do from PTA to conflict resolutions. For school, my school is School 53. I brought my daughter up here with me. Everything that I've been through because, I've been through it. Been through the school system, did good and everything. Took a wrong turn. Stuff happens. But now, the one thing about it, I'm an alumnus of the school my daughter go to. The one thing I've noticed in Buffalo is that, maybe it's across the whole district, but really it's all across the country, is that our black and Latino students is the main ones that's being suspended. I mean, violence, I understand that, you know. If my kids are violent, send them home, or something like that, because that's not, you know, it needs to be. But, you know, as far as for this little small stuff, like I have an example. One day I'm in the school walking, minding my business. I hear a teacher, you know, teaching a young lady gets into a little altercation. They both was, you know, it was verbal. They both was aggressive towards each other, you know. So I didn't think nothing of it. I go sit outside, talking to another parent. I see the young lady's parent come in and they leave, and I'm like, okay, it's gonna take a day or so to let this calm down. About 3 days later, you know, it's nice, believe it or not, we do have nice weather in Buffalo. I'm sitting out on the school step, and I see the young lady coming back, and the first thing I say, wow, they suspended her for this? I mean, it was, from what I seen, the teacher was wrong. You know, but not to take sides, because if we had intervention, we wouldn't have had this problem. So, you know, certain things, what you do, right, what we really need to do now is try to find a way to keep our children in school. Like for wearing your little hoodies, stuff like that, or, you know, we don't, like you touched on, we don't know what that kid went through at home. Right. You know, this, you know, because he might not have heard nothing at home like, I love you. How much homework do you have? Did you finish your homework? Do you want to watch the game with me, son or daughter? But might not have nobody in his house for that, you know? But we just have to, because like with this here, with that, what happened with this young lady and that teacher, if someone had been in that school, just to listen, sit down with the parent too. Also, you have to bring the parents, because education starts at home. We just can't put it on the teachers. You know, it's easy for us to pass the buck. Education starts at home. Because if you're not really, it just so happens that this happened to be Black History Month. Yeah, I mean, us black folks, remember when we couldn't go to school. You know, better not been able to talk about reading. Oh, no, that wasn't nice. One of you kids that don't know about it, I'm not that old, but I remember when I couldn't go to the bathroom. I wanted to try to see my sister in Memphis, Tennessee. Matter of fact, I caught pneumonia because the white man told me I better not go in that bathroom and pee. You know, me being me, I wouldn't pee anyway. So make long story short, you know. But I went in there and did it anyway, but, you know, the consequences was me being real sick, but, you know what I mean? But, you know, education is the key. That's the only way most of our kids is going to get through anything. But they're not hearing that at home. And I can't do it by myself as far as being a parent. I can't be responsible for a whole district. Maybe that's, we leave here today, we'll find some way to try to, you know, deal with this, deal with this subject. In our district, though, across the district, suspension is a normal thing. You know, they don't believe in intervention, and I found out before I came up here the other day that we do have staff in our schools that's their job. But they're not doing their job because, you know, let's send our children home. But now I've been trying to recruit parents, you know, been doing a good job, administrators, teachers, community people, clergy, politicians, anybody. And let's, you know, we got to come together with this. It just can't out you against me and I'm against you. You know, no. We got to worry about our children. Just because my son or daughter be wandering in the hall, it's not no reason to send them home. Really, we got to change the culture. Changing the culture is dealing with this piece of paper right here I have in my hand right now. Code of conduct. You know, with AQE, we've done a lot of work across the district. We've been building a bridge with the community. This document right here. Trying to get everything together with this. It needed to change because this was a very, very biased policy towards kids. You know, no matter what the kid did, the way the code of conduct was set up, you know, I mean, you can go in there with Johnny, God bless the dead, Johnny Cochran. He was guilty because of this. I mean, but we sat down because it was very vague, but we sat down as a community and the AQE and two other organizations, and we put because we was tired of our kids being suspended. Like I said, we're not that many of us in school, but when it comes to suspension, you think the whole Buffalo district was all black, was all minority school system. But contrary to belief, it's not. But we had protesters, went to City Hall, little town hall meetings like this, whatever you have, and we had the associate superintendent that kind of fell on board with it. He was our target. And we reeled him on in. It was a lot of work, but we reeled him on in, and he's really not a bad guy now. But he's working with us. Well, no, for real. I wouldn't mention his name, but you know, I said I wasn't mentioning no names. But he's associate superintendent of Buffalo. If he was here, you looked at him, I would whistle. I still wouldn't get him up, but I would whistle. You know, but this here piece of paper right here is very important. You know, because now what we got to do, we got to change the culture. Each building has its own culture. We can't do this vanilla. Say we're going to come up with something that's going to work everywhere. Can't work. Your school, that's in your school district. You might have 8 different buildings with 8 different cultures. So what's good for the one building is not going to work with others. So we all have to come together to try to form something that's going to work with everyone. You know, can't just pick it out and then we got to think about the Caucasian students too, because they got some bad kids too. We just don't hear about them, but when we hear about them, it's too late. You know, they shooting up something. I mean, excuse me for being me, I'm not going to bite my tongue. I hope one of y'all ain't in here today and I stepped on your toes and I did, I'm sorry. Wait till I get back to Buffalo before you do anything stupid. Okay? Because all these people, ain't none of us have no vests up here, we all be sorry. But this is what they're paid to do. I'm volunteering, so that, you know, you want to shoot people that's getting paid for this, that's not me. I'm a retired construction worker. I want all y'all to know that, okay? I'm just doing this out the love of my heart, and I might have my daughter, she probably done put her head down talking about daddy. But anyway, let me get back on point. Together with the Advancement Project from Washington, D.C., we pushed for the new code of conduct. And like I said, it's been a lot of work, and Jason will probably touch on it too. And it's come through. The district is working with us to change the climate. That's what we're looking for now, to change the climate. This here will work. It's working, and we want it to work everywhere. You know, it's not all the way done. We always looking for new ideas, but hopefully we can be the ones that y'all can say, well, you know, Buffalo's known for something else besides snow. We done changed the culture. We done changed the culture. You know, so I'm also involved in task forces with superintendents, you know, other parents and stuff, to try to really change the school climate. Because that's what it's going to take. We're making progress. A lot of work we still have to do to make sure all our kids remain in school, to get a fair shot, because education is going to be the key right now, because only one thing I can tell them, they still haven't found a computer to dig a ditch yet. So you could dream construction, but in a minute they're going to find a way to take that shovel out your hand. So you're going to have to, you know, but now you even need a college degree right now. I heard even be a laborer now. So, you know, it's, you know, like I said, we're going to need our education, but we're going to need our kids to be there, because they still trying to cheat. They don't want everybody to be smart. They still need this, you know, they don't want no middle class. You know, so that's all I have to say. I went a little bit over. You know, like I said, any Columbine, Sandy Hook, anybody here, I'm sorry. This lady will speak next. Thank you.
All right, Keith, thank you. And our next speaker is Marsha Weissman, the Executive Director of the Center for Community Alternatives, which is based in Syracuse and New York City both.
Hi everybody, I'm standing so I can click. I am not technologically well equipped, so if it's driving me crazy and driving you crazy, I'm gonna just stop. But a little bit about CCA. We are a not-for-profit organization that works to reduce mass incarceration, and we do it through a framework that sees these issues fundamentally as civil rights and human rights issues. And in fact, it was our work with kids in the juvenile justice system that brought us to what's now called the school-to-prison pipeline. But this was back in the 80s, and kids we were working with in courts had already been suspended from school, and most of them were put in so-called alternative schools. And part of what we needed to do was make sure they went to school, and frankly, we were horrified to see conditions in alternative schools. Libraries that didn't have a book in them, right? Doors that were locked a minute after, the opening bell. I want to say one thing. I came in somewhat in the middle of the plenary this morning, and somebody was saying that our schools have not adjusted to the 21st century. I actually have to disagree, at least for urban schools with primarily young people with kids of color. Our schools, I think, have tragically adjusted to the 21st century by becoming prisons. And no longer are we training children from poor Black and Latino communities to engage in the workforce, but rather we are inculcating them with experiences that formerly were limited to prisons and jails. And that's America's legacy of mass incarceration. And if folks have read the new Jim Crow, you sort of get what I mean. So we have to open our eyes and see what our schools have become under our noses. And I'm not even saying we all are acquiescing to this, but nonetheless, this is what our schools look like, or too many of them in poor cities with minority populations, the majority population. So I'm going to talk for the most part about this proposal that we have for consideration for New York State. And one of the most exciting things about the proposal is that after all of these years of working in silos, the criminal justice system, juvenile justice system, education reform community, we've come together, right, and are making a point that we can reduce, if not end, mass incarceration and use monies to reinvest both in supportive criminal and juvenile justice programs as well as restorative justice programs in school. So this is very quickly a chart that shows New York State compared to the United States in terms of the numbers of people in prison. The good news is, in New York State, we've dramatically reduced our prison population. You'll hear, if you wander the halls of the state, lots of folks patting themselves on the back. Way too soon to do that. Our incarceration rate, and particularly our incarceration rate for people of color, still far exceeds international norms. We're still locking up so many more people than other countries in the world. So this is what New York State looks like according to the school report card with school suspensions. We suspend an enormous number of kids out of school, and this is out of school suspension for at least 1 day. We can see that the numbers are going down, but they're still extraordinarily high. And Black students make up the majority of young people suspended from school, over 50%, even though Black student population is only about 28%. So this is an example of what it looks like in upstate New York. I mean, I can't say that this is exactly typical, but it's not just the downstate New York problem. And so what I did was took some data from the state report card. Syracuse, the middle column, is a rural area in Onondaga County, Tully, New York, and then Fayetteville is a suburb. And what you see are the far more suspensions, right, in the Syracuse City School District, which looks a lot like urban school districts around the country. So the other school districts, the other two, have suspension rates of like 5%, give or take, and the Syracuse School District, it's about 25%. So there's a clear nexus between poverty, race, and school pushout. There's not a lot of information, I'm not going to repeat this, about school-based arrests, but you can see in New York City, the majority of kids who are arrested in schools are kids of color. Racial disparity exists at every point in the school-to-prison pipeline, including adult incarceration. people of color are disproportionately represented, whether they're pushed out of school, whether they're put in juvenile facilities, or whether they're incarcerated in prisons. So that's all the bad news. There actually is some good news and some opportunities. We have some opportunity to reform, I think, both our educational system and our justice system. So this shows a decrease in state incarceration, how many people, the fewer numbers of people who are going into state prison. This is a map of New York State prison system, and the good news here is that 11 prisons have been closed across the state. And there are 2 additional prison closings being proposed this year. New York State is finally wrapping its head around that our economic development plan for upstate New York should not rest on the backs of caging young black and brown men. Similarly, there's been a good deal of juvenile justice reform in the state. 22 Office of Children and Family Services facilities have closed. And there's now a movement both in New York and this year even in upstate New York to have kids kept who are in the juvenile justice system no longer put in places far from their homes, but rather kept at home as much as possible, or if not possible, at least in places very close to their homes, so their parents can stay involved. So these are just some of the big reforms that have happened in the state over the last few years. Again, not nearly enough, but at least it's going in the right direction. Drug law reform, the Close to Home initiative, and this year a bunch of advocates are really taking on the campaign to raise the age in New York so that children under the age of 18, between 16 and 18, are not treated in the adult court system. So I think this sets the platform for the proposal that we're working on. Again, criminal justice and education advocates. And the goal is, and I'm going to just read this, create school and community-based programs to improve student outcomes, support positive behaviors and opportunities, and reduce youth interaction with the criminal justice system and adult recidivism. And we want to do this. We have some very practical, concrete ways. This is not just pie in the sky. So simply put, we can expand the temporary release program in New York and invest those savings in alternative to incarceration and reentry programs on the justice side and restorative justice programs on the school side. We expect that moving forward with this kind of approach would reduce school suspensions, reduce school-based arrests, reduce the use of incarceration, and improve recidivism, reduce recidivism. So very quickly, what is temporary release? We consider it a best practice. Temporary release is a program where people who are nearing their, the end of their prison sentence are released. They're still under the custody of the Department of Corrections, but they're allowed to go out to employment or education. That makes sense to me, and I don't care whether somebody served 5 years or 25 years. Why would you want somebody to just walk out on the street with 40 bucks, right? Why doesn't it make more sense to transition out into a job and or a school? New York State used to have a fairly robust temporary release program. At its height, it was about 24,000 people. Right now, there's only about 700 people enrolled. It's not for lack of eligibility. One of the reasons, there's a couple of reasons that there's fewer people in the program. One is that they tightened up who could even get in, right? But that's not the reason why. It's a political decision to underutilize temporary release. There are plenty of otherwise eligible people who qualify for the program who are not being allowed admission. The thing about expanding the temporary release program is it saves a huge amount of money. It costs about a quarter of the amount of money to keep somebody in temporary release compared to full incarceration. The full incarceration costs in the state are now about $60,000 per year. So there's an enormous, yes, we can send all the kids to Harvard for 2 years maybe, right? But minimally, we could expand temporary release. So our proposal is to do that and reinvest the funds that we save on the incarceration side into restorative justice and expansion of alternative to incarceration and reentry programs. I think we've heard a number of things about restorative justice programs. School need resources to do this. They need a culture change to do this. They need to support students to do this and teachers to do this. Alternative to incarceration programs, there's a whole variety of them. I'll be glad to answer questions if folks have them later on. But housing programs, drug treatment programs, jobs programs, special programs for youth. Research has shown that ATI programs have a lower recidivism rate than incarceration. So what can we do to make this happen? Not just move our proposal forward. To do that, I think that we're going to be looking for folks to ally with us and take this up when we do our lobbying at the state level. But you can contact your state legislature. We're a member of the Dignity in Schools campaign, and I would strongly urge people who are interested in advocating on these issues to really take a look and join. Support the national call for a moratorium on school suspension. And I guess there's other examples, but I know Dignity in Schools have an example of a model disciplinary code. And here's just some ideas for additional resources. But we're at a moment of time when I think we're getting that punishment does not work and that there are more effective solutions to social problems than locking people up or pushing them out of school or putting them in schools that more resemble prisons than they do centers of learning. Thank you very much.
Transitioning to Jason, I just want to say that one of the organizations that's been involved in calling for the national moratorium is the Schott Foundation for Public Education and the Opportunity to Learn Action Fund. And we have representatives from, we have Joe Bishop from the Opportunity to Learn Action Fund, and Tony Simmons from the Schott Foundation, and Cassie Schwerner from the Schott Foundation. And I would be remiss not to mention that the Opportunity to Learn Action Fund is co-sponsoring, helping underwrite this conference today. So we're very pleased to have them here with us. We'll turn it over now to Jason Santa Cruz of the Advancement Project. Jason?
Afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Right, so as Billy said, I'm Jason Santa Cruz from Advancement Project in Washington, D.C. Just a little bit about us. We are a civil rights racial justice organization based in D.C. And we work on a project where we're trying to end what we call the schoolhouse to jailhouse track, which is, many of you know, is the school to prison pipeline. And so we've been doing that for about a decade or so. And our model is that we work with grassroots community groups across the country to support their campaigns to end the school to prison pipeline in their communities. So in that regard, we provide legal support, policy support, advocacy support, strategic support, communication support, research support, a whole range of things. You notice I said legal was just one part of that because we do more than just legal strategies, because we've seen on this issue that that's just one way of many ways in which to tackle this problem, and you'll see that as I go through here a little bit. I'm glad I'm going at the end because this presentation will sort of wrap up nicely some of the things you've heard, just to bring us back before we can take questions. But what I'm going to do is talk first a little bit, again, a history of the school to prison pipeline, and then provide a national perspective on what's going on with this issue, and then I'll end with some success stories of what we've seen from throughout the country, and also some ideas about what you all can do in addition to the program that Marsha talked about here in New York State to move this issue a little bit forward. So, as you've heard, this whole issue of the school to prison pipeline is intimately connected to the rise of zero tolerance policies, and these really started in the 1980s with the war on drugs, and expanded in the 1990s after Columbine happened. And I actually just expanded this slide recently because I've added Newtown 2010, right? We're in a very pivotal moment when we're seeing the federal government start to think about re-escalating these zero tolerance policies that for the last 10, 20 years we've tried to get rid of. So I think it's really great that you all are here to learn about what we can do to make sure this doesn't happen. When we talk about zero tolerance, it really is a recharacterization of student behavior and kids being punished for being kids. Instead of pushing and shoving, we're seeing students being accused of battery. Instead of swiping headphones, it's now theft or robbery. And instead of talking back, it's disorderly conduct. This is a new slide I just put together as well. This is just in the past month. We saw a kindergartner in Pennsylvania suspended for threatening to shoot a Hello Kitty bubble gun. We saw a teenager in Virginia suspended for bringing his prescription penicillin to school. Note the race and the gender of the student who that happened to. Some of you know this. In the Bronx, the 7-year-old who was handcuffed for 6 hours for allegedly stealing $5. So these are just things in the last month that have happened. As you've heard, we've wasted billions of dollars on this issue, from administering these programs in the first place, to some of the metal detectors that Maria talked about, to healthcare costs, juvenile justice costs that Marsha was talking about, all these prisons that we're paying for to make this happen. And it's really created, as we've talked about many times, a school-to-prison pipeline. I want to put forward another definition for you all, just as a way of thinking about it. But one way to think of it, these are the policies and practices that directly and indirectly push students out of schools and on a pathway to prison. So as we know, it's not just about the Bronx 6-year-old who's been handcuffed, but it's also about when a student is pushed out of school and perhaps suspended, they lose their interest in engaging in their education. They start to get involved with gangs perhaps, or just with the wrong crowd, and then we see that spiral happen as well. So I think it's really important because it's both not just the direct way that these students end up in the system, but also the indirect way that this happens. So as we've seen nationally, we've seen that these suspension rates have increased. We've seen they've also increased, especially for Black and Latino students. We've seen this increase happen such that it's increased for Black and Latino students and decreased for white students. So the disparity exists, and more troubling, it's growing, which is what this slide shows here. On a sort of brighter note, there has been a movement that has emerged, I think most recently capped off by this hearing before the Senate that was one of the most highly attended legislative hearings of the last year about the school-to-prison pipeline. And it is really driven by parents and students who are sitting here, about advocates, and also state and federal reform that's happening, and we are seeing some great results from that. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, Advancement Project partners with grassroots community groups across the country on this work. So in Chicago, we work with a group called Voices of Youth in Chicago Education. And in the last year, we brought attention to a serious charter school problem that was happening, where students were being fined for not having a belt, and for slouching, and for chewing bubble gum. And really just how horrible that is. And that's a fight that's still continuing. As any of you know who know about the Chicago system and how that works, it's a beast. So it is a longer-term campaign that we're lodging there. We also edited the discipline code there with the following key provisions, including limiting the amount of time that someone could be suspended, especially automatically. In Baltimore, we also worked with some groups there, and we changed their code of conduct, and that was in 2006-07. And in 2009-10, by that time, we've decreased out-of-school suspensions by 44%. So we know that this is a policy. And I really want to connect this to what has been referenced. This is what we're doing in Buffalo, which is, my hope is that, the next year or the next couple of years when I'm giving this presentation again, I will have a slide that has Buffalo and talks about how we passed the new discipline code, which is sort of, there's handouts there that look like this. And we really think that it will be the most progressive discipline code in the country. Yes. And from that, we expect to see, I'm expecting to see a slide that says Buffalo on there, and if Buffalo can do it, I think any other place can do it too. Denver is perhaps the place where Advancement Project has had the most success because we've been with this partner for a long time. It really is a grassroots-led effort. In the last 5 years, we rewrote their discipline code, and we really think it is right now the most progressive discipline code across the country. And we also implemented a restorative justice program there. We also passed a statewide law ending zero tolerance and calling for alternatives. And right now we're in the process of rewriting a memorandum of understanding between police and the district, and also with that new state law, making the progressive discipline code even more progressive than it is now. And similarly, in that same time, 44% decrease in out-of-school suspensions because of all of these changes that have happened. And it's also because In particular, the community there has really taken leadership and initiative on this issue. And as was talked about, and again, to sort of bring it back, like these sorts of documents probably exist in other types of places, and they're great, and they work really, they look nice on paper, right? But it is about implementation and making sure that we're holding institutions accountable. And that's why your presence here, learning about this, especially I'm looking at some of the youth around here, that's why your presence is really important to making sure that these changes actually come to fruition. So that's sort of a little bit about what Denver has done. I want to give just a little bit more sort of concreteness to what we've talked about, which is restorative justice, which is really an alternative to suspension. And these are 3 places around the country where we've seen that done really well. As I mentioned in Denver, just to highlight some of the things, when there's a fight that happens in Denver, rather than suspending both students, they bring them in for peer mediation to talk about their issues. And then they also lay out a contract as a way for the 2 students to work out their issues, right? So as we know, suspending a student does not get to the root of what is causing a problem, but programs like restorative justice make a better attempt to get to those roots so that we know they don't happen again. In Oakland, they're doing this really cool peer court type system where it's all youth run, and that's where they deal with issues in their school for first-time nonviolent type of offenses, which is a really innovative idea that we've seen has worked. And in Minnesota, they've hired restorative justice coordinators on a full-time basis to be trained and to incorporate that into their schools. So that's just an idea of sort of what is going on with restorative justice in other places. We also have looked at New York law, especially around suspensions and expulsions and arrests, and there are really some key opportunities that you see listed up here about how we can change and improve the way that we do discipline here in New York and improve the outcomes for students. A couple of those things are to require progressive discipline, so rather than sort of going straight to a suspension, perhaps we require other interventions like was talked about, and also require alternatives to suspension, like restorative justice, like what's being put forward in the proposal that Marcia talked about. And these are some things that you can look into and think about here in New York as ways to improve what's going on a bigger scale. So, whoops, I don't want to end with this slide, which is wondering, can New York State be a success story? Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. Okay, so we have about 20 minutes left, and we're going to allow that time for questions from the audience. So if people have a question, just hold your hand up, I'll call up on you, and then you please stand up to ask your question. Right here in the middle.
Jason, some folks wanted you to back up a couple slides, just the last, where the websites are.
Yeah.
We didn't have time to. Yeah, the one before was the table. Yeah. The one before that. And then we did.
Would that
be a handout?
Yes.
Could that page be,
This page here, yeah, you know what, we're actually,
handout because it's hard to get all the
Yeah.
facts that were related. I mean, now this first lady that spoke had a very dense talk. Every sentence she had a fact. I couldn't get it all down. I couldn't get much at all down.
so we are, among other things, we're videoing each workshop, and then taking notes and going to compile it also. We will be posting, and also the stuff that's up there right now, we're actually working on a proposal to advance these particular items legislatively. So
So how do we get it?
we will be looking at posting it through our website or our Facebook page,
What's the website?
aqeny.org.
That's Binghamton.
If people come up.
Oh, you can get it from Larry. So let's take questions for our speakers. Yes, in the back.
Yes, thank you very much. And I just want to call to your attention, coming from the side of things that's looking at the ed reform movement, or as Diane Ravitch asked us to call it, the corporate reform movement. School closings are very much hinged to these school suspension rates. And so it's in the interest of the ed reform movement to have these suspensions. And I would just urge you, as you look for legislative relief from the suspensions, that you also work with the legislative relief from the corporate reform movement, because they're driving each other. It's really driving the school closures.
All right, true.
That's definitely something, go ahead, Maria.
Yeah, so these, the different work that we do, and I'm speaking for New York City now, the different work that we do in New York City is not separate from each other. So this is particularly talking about the suspensions and arrest piece, but in New York City, we are engaging in a heavy 2013 campaign that's calling for a moratorium on school closures and working with nationally right now, actually, a movement for a moratorium on school closures, co-locations nationally. So a lot of this effort is very much together.
As far as I speak for Buffalo, my school, School 53, was on the list to be closed. So we came together as a community, we got on our school board members, got on our board elected officials and everything, we stopped it. Not only did we stop, because I said, why would y'all close the school down and y'all scheduling for reconstruction? And what they was gonna do after they put all them people to work, they was gonna shut the school down. We came together, we got everybody together. Not only did we keep the school open, it's now, the first was on like the failing list, now the school is improved. But you bring your community together and work, and don't take no for an answer. You know, if they gonna try to threaten you with all kind of stuff, well, we ain't going for that. You know, you have a lot, you'd be surprised what you can do when it take numbers. You know, I started out by myself and numbers grow, but you gotta get every parent within that school there. Then once you get that parent together, then you get parents from the other schools within that district, because they're gonna say, whoa, they close you, they're gonna close us next. You see what I'm saying? If you come together, you'd be surprised what the community do, because especially around like now, you're gonna get the midterm elections, politicians are gonna be scared, they don't want your vote. So now's the time to move.
Right up front here?
Two quick questions. There was a handout on the table there called Supportive Schools, Safe Communities, which looks very much like a request for proposals for grants, but I couldn't be absolutely sure that that was the correct interpretation, and nowhere does it say what agency is giving the grants.
Okay, so that is the summary of the proposal that we have put together and shared with folks in the governor's office. And what we're suggesting is if there's an expansion of temporary release, that the savings that come from that be reinvested and then put out in a request for proposal. So that's our vision of it, right?
The other question is, you mentioned in Oakland, California, one of the programs is youth courts. Actually, that is also a program in New York State, with a slight difference, that in New York State, as I understand it, the judge and juries also are youths. And I wondered whether you see that as part of this overall reform, what the place is for youth courts, or sometimes when they're placed in schools, they're called school courts. Where does that fit into what you've been talking about? It hasn't been mentioned in New York State, only in Oakland.
Yes. So just a clarification with that, actually the Oakland program is similar. So it's youth juries, youth judges, there's like a supervisor, if you will, who's an adult, but everything else is youth-based. And it does fit in because what we're looking for are alternatives to suspension, right? So one iteration of that is the restorative justice program, which includes things like having peace circles and mediation and all of those types of programs. And another alternative to suspension is instead of being suspended, you go through a jury of your peers and they sort of decide what the best outcome is for you, right? So if our goal here collectively is to really to lessen and to end out of school suspensions in the state of New York. So we're trying to find ways that are sensible and research-based and are effective at dealing with student problems and behavior and improving school climate that are not suspension. And I think this is one of those proposals. And in terms of whether that fits in here or whatnot, I mean, I'm not as familiar with sort of how New York State is run, but I think, quite honestly, I think anything is on the table. Is what you can.
So you're not supporting one versus another?
No, I think we're just offering a menu of different choices that you could look into.
So with respect to youth courts, I would really, as somebody who's worked for 30 plus years in the criminal and juvenile justice system, I would really urge that if this is a model we want to move forward with in New York, that it actually really be school-based and not court-based, right? There's a lot of specialty courts in New York State on the adult side. You know, you can't have a hangnail without having to go into a court. But at the end of the day, that really perpetuates what we see as sort of mass criminalization and mass incarceration, right? Why? I mean, again, some of these courts do nice things, right? But people of means, if they have a mental health problem, they don't have to go into a court to get treatment, right? The message should be that human problems and social problems need to be dealt with in the community by strengthening community organizations, not judicial and criminal justice organizations. The best, and you know, I have nice stories to tell about people, you know, working in the system, but at the end of the day, it's like, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So let's
These
keep
are
it in the
community
schools.
things, not government things.
Okay, Paul in the back there? You know what, I should have been doing this all along. Can you introduce yourselves when I call on you, please, just before you speak?
Paul Webster, New York State teacher, and this question for Dr. White or Jason. Recently, we had a problem in the Schenectady City school districts where students were actually coming to school to fight. When you look at some of the gang problems that we have in some neighborhoods or communities, that at the time I was the county NAACP president, in going into the city and talking and working with the parents were sending their children to school to fight because on the streets, an adult is not mandated to stop the fight. But in school, the adults are mandated to stop the fight. That it was safer to fight in school. Yeah. Safer to fight in school than it is on the street. How do we deal with problems like that? That was the problem that we were having in Schenectady, which also resulted in 4 bully sides. 4 bully sides. That means you were bullied to the point where you committed suicide and 2 attempted suicide. How do we deal with those type of situations that lead to school disciplinary problems?
Glad he mentioned dogs.
So actually the first point I want to make is that, like, what we're proposing is that it actually even doesn't get to the point that you're talking about, right? Because we're talking about when we see problems in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, we're dealing with those issues then by providing the appropriate social supports, by providing the right references to support staff that need to happen, by providing mentorship to students when it needs to happen, by involving parents. And all these things I just said are really sort of like some of the alternatives to suspension that we're talking about. We're trying to create a culture and a climate where students don't even get to the point that you're talking about, right? Now, obviously, as a lot of you know, trying to create that dynamic or that system takes a long time. And we need to start somewhere. And so, like the folks are doing in Buffalo, the first part is to change their policy so that it makes sense, so that when a student who is, you know, in second grade acts up, rather than pushing them out of school, we're saying, you know, why don't you sit down and write an apology about what you did and think about it, right? And so what we're really trying to do is to target those behaviors early enough so that it creates a situation where it even never gets to the point that you're getting at. Now I'm saying that, but it's also obviously with a longer term, you know, lens on what's going on. It's not a short-term solution to what's happening, but we really have to start somewhere. And I think that's the first place that we would have to start.
But I actually think there is somewhat of an immediate answer. The question isn't that adults shouldn't intervene, right? And if schools are the places where adults have to intervene, the question really is, who's doing the intervening, right? And then what is the response? So in the juvenile justice field, there is a recognition, finally, that the adolescent brain is still developing. And that's as true whether somebody is, you know, committing an assault or stealing candy from the store, right? So if there's fights that are going on in the school, adults need to intervene and there needs to be a response. What we would say is it doesn't need to be law enforcement that does that intervening. And the response is the array of responses that you know, we've heard of in respect to, you know, restorative justice. It's not an either or, and pulling out the worst case scenarios will never move us from really what's happening on a day-to-day basis, which is so many kids getting suspended from school and arrested for seriously not significant problems, not violent behaviors.
Excuse me, I would like to touch on that too, as far as a parent. From what I'm saying, from my understanding, from what you're saying, is that the parents is passing the buck. You can't let them get away with that. What y'all have to do is set up a mechanism where that parent that's sending his kid to school to start that violence, find a way to make them pay. Maybe I'll just say, just for example, if they happen to be on social services. Your kids start doing, you sending your kid to school doing that, okay, let's try to play with your money a little bit. The problem is stopped. They say they're not on that. They working, they got a job, going to work every day, run that plan. Your son coming to school to start that, no, let me just, because it's going to say now, you got to miss a day of work without paying and probably pay a fine.
That's right.
They will stop that. You can't put that on the school system. That is not a school problem. That is a home problem.
That's right.
Quit letting these parents off the hook. I'm a parent. I'm not going to pass the buck. I'll talk about the school. I'll talk about the parent. I'll talk about the politician. But you can't expect that kid to do what that kid is doing now. But if he on the street, stop. I wish my dog would catch my dog. One of my kids doing something on the street I don't like. Yeah, you can call the police, but it won't be for them. It'll be for me. See, because you're going to pay for it one way or the other. But don't pass that buck right there. The gangs and all that. I was a gang member and all that, but I didn't let my daddy know I was in the gang. When I came home, that jacket was hidden very well. But I wasn't going to, I'm just saying, all that starts at home. Quit letting these parents get away. That's all I got to say. Yeah, we'll come to you next.
I would like to talk. I call for them. And let me tell you with this
wait, ma'am?
parent call for yes, Walkston.
Ma'am, can we just let him have his question and then we'll deal?
We're going to come to you right after his question.
What I am trying to tell you, I'm a call for them.
Okay, well, say it. I'm sorry. You may have
What I'm trying to tell you is that the parents was involved in children fighting and that are telling police. When you go to the police and you tell them, so you have to tell headmaster first, and then they would make a report. And with this fighting, parents have to know how to go in it. Because I'm talking from experience. I know two parents, you know, the children fighting, and then the whole one got killed, you understand? So the parents are the two mothers will fight or the father will fight. So the parents have to know how to go in to the children. What I would say to them, you have to speak to your children. Some will say, he beat you? Go back and beat you. And if they beat you, or beat you, which that is wrong. Is that all I have to do?
That's why I'm saying now that starts at home.
Yes.
Yep.
That's
So,
what I think.
Robert Jackson, New York City Councilman. And I appreciate the workshop, and I like a lot of suggestions. But let me just throw this out to you. Some of the critics say that, you know, that half of the households are now headed by young mothers, blacks and Latinos. Shake your head.
I'm a single parent. I'm just saying that's another escape. I understand what you're saying. I'm touchy about that.
Can I finish if you don't mind? I'm just asking, can I finish?
Go ahead. I'm just saying I'm touchy about that subject. I'm through with it.
I know you are.
I'm through with it.
And this is a touchy subject also. So many of the parents are one family household. And a lot of the kids are out of control. So what do you advocates have to say when critics say, I'm not saying I say, critics say that because of the single household parent, because children have not been raised appropriately, now they are out of control. What do you do to get them back in check, understanding that in New York State, the state budget is decreasing the amount of money to deal with these issues? how do you deal with that?
Okay, so the question is really like, how do you respond to that? How do you respond to that criticism? What's our answer back as advocates, you know?
That's what I want to
Yep. So, I mean, I think in particularly New York City, we've seen that that's actually what's going on, right? So there's this division on blaming the parents, they're blaming the students, they're blaming the teachers, they're blaming the principals, they're blaming everyone, right? And then what we're seeing is that that's actually not getting to the root of what the issue is, right? So we're cutting all social services across the board, not just in education, so right? So we're cutting healthcare. You know, we have more and more young parents, right, that don't have access to healthcare for themselves or their children, right? We're damaging the education that they're getting, right? We are not paying people a living wage to be able to afford the supports that they need, right? We're not giving people paid sick leave, so now they have to go to work sick, right? Or they go to work, they don't get any money, right? So I think if you frame the conversation overall of like a human, economic, right, justice framework where we're talking about we can't get to any of these things if all these cuts are happening simultaneously. If we're not framing it as that, then we're always going to get stuck with is the Department of Education's fault, or is the parents' fault, or is the teachers' fault. Those unions, they just, you know, all they care about are their jobs, right? If we allow that rhetoric to get into the work that we're doing, and we're not talking about how do we build alliances and coalitions with other partners that are in these different fields to really think about what is a just education, what is a just city.